you for joining us this evening. Looks like we have a full house, and that's great. We want to thank, when I say we, I mean WBHM would like to thank Jake Reese, his staff at the Alabama Booksmith for putting this together. Mike Morgan with WBHM. You may not recognize my voice, but you might recognize Andrew Yeager's voice. He's over there at the console. He's Morning Edition. And I believe we left the rest of them at the house. They're dead asleep or something. WBHM wants to thank Pat Conroy for signing the book cover, this nice book cover, to the best of our knowledge, the only one in the state of Alabama. It is being auctioned off, silent auction. The price so far is $425. All proceeds benefit WBHM. And we'll be staying here after the event as long as there are bidders out there, because we know how to take your money. Again, we want to thank you for joining us this evening. It's going to be a great event. You'll enjoy reading the book. I suspect most of you have already got through several chapters already. But if not, you'll have a great read tomorrow and for the rest of the week or so. I do want to, once again, thank you for joining us this evening. Remind you that all proceeds for this event benefit Public Radio WBHM 90.3. For that, we thank you. And for the introductions of our special guests this evening, I give you Jake Reese of the Alabama Booksmith.
Thank you very much. Wow. For the past 2 decades, we've had the good fortune to be around many world-class authors and literary events. And I can honestly say that nothing has come close to the electricity in the air this evening. Created by these writers celebrating this book. I hope you can all feel it. Evidently, from that applause, you can feel it. And the magic door hasn't even opened yet, but it's real short. Before we bring out the superstars, please allow me to salute the staff at the Doubletree Hotel. These guys have just been great. Now they're on And while Mike has been gracious enough to mention us, let me tell you, the folks at WBHM are awesome. Mike, Barry, Greg, Andrew, Leslie, Sarah, great. Thank you. You're wonderful collaborators. And hey, guys, let's do this again sometime. Whew. And of course, I can't ever say enough about the staff at the Alabama Booksmith. The most fabulous bunch of folks. Cream cheese. Hunter, Lauren, Justin, Michael, Mike, and Mike. They're voracious readers. Very, very smart, helpful to a fault. And actually, there are 2 Phi Beta Kappas on staff, and I would ask you to recognize them, but you've done that. You folks are about to be turned on, and hopefully your cell phones are about to be turned off. While I tend to a little chore, I would appreciate it if all would do just that, please. As you can see, this is a sold-out audience. We have guests that we have recognized from 15 states, and there are probably several others that we've missed. And speaking of the sold-out crowd, I would be remiss, those of you who don't know, many of you already do, we have turned away pretty close to 1,000 folks who would like to have more tickets. As great as the folks here at the Hotel R, I guess we'll have the next literary event at Legion Field. Can you imagine being able to scout a ticket to a literary event? Honestly, and this is the truth, we've had about a dozen people, or probably more, this just that I know about, have offered money, and several said, look, I got a line, I'll give you $100 a ticket. Some of you may want to sell. Anybody want to sell your ticket for $100? No takers. Okay, it is now showtime. Random House is the world's largest publisher. They say that the release of South of Broad is the literary event of the season. Readers in this part of the country think it's the literary event of the decade. In addition to the fact that the author is America's favorite storyteller, much of the focus and the buzz about this book is that it's been 14 years since Beach Music, his last novel. And I'm going to ask you to go back in your memory 14 years ago to 1995. Gasoline was barely $1 a gallon. Carol Shields' Stone Diaries won the Pulitzer Prize, and Sabbath's Theater by Philip Roth was named National Book Award winner. Gene Stallings was the coach at Alabama, and Terry Bowden at Auburn. Also in 1995, just a few blocks from this very spot, a beautiful young first-time novelist had her national debut book signing. And like tonight, there was a lot of chemistry in the air. The book was Making Waves in Zion. Fans! And that author is going to join us in just a minute. I hope you are into book blurbs. I'd like to read a blurb from the jacket cover of that book. Quote, "This is a wonderful and hilarious novel. The book sounds as if the whole South got together in the backyard and started telling stories that really count," unquote. Does everybody know who wrote that blurb? Pat Conroy. You did well. That first book was released by a small Alabama press and has since been purchased by Hyperion, the same large New York house that has published all the writer's subsequent books, bestsellers that they are. They shortened the title to Making Waves. Obviously, these folks knew what they were doing because Sunday Wife, Same Sweet Girls, and Queen of Broken Hearts have all been tremendously successful. Her upcoming book has the working title Bridal Falls, and you can count on another Birmingham book signing in the spring of 2010. Fortunately, for the best-known writing couple on Fripp Island, somebody in the family has been producing these last 14 years. You did so well on the first audience participation part. Let's try it again. If you'll turn to the dedication page of South of Broad, you may read along with me, and again I quote, "This book is dedicated to my wife and fellow novelist Cassandra King, who helped more than anyone in bringing South of Broad to its publication. To me, she is the finest thing ever produced on an Alabama farm. Please welcome Cassandra King. The next trip down memory lane only goes back 12 years. And I'll stick with this theme of blurb reading and share what's on the cover of our next guest's first book. And for the last time, I will quote, "Rick Bragg writes like a man on fire, and all over but the shouting is a work of art." I thought of Melville, I thought of Faulkner. Because I love the English language, I knew I was reading one of the best books I've ever read. By explaining his life to the world, Rick Bragg explained part of my life to me. I fell in love with his mother 100 times. I wept when the book ended. I never met Rick Bragg in my life, but I called him up and told him he had written a masterpiece. And I sent flowers to his mother, unquote. Of course, that was written by a smart group. Rick Bragg won the Pulitzer Prize and the Casson Award, given to the best nonfiction writer in Alabama. To say his family trilogy is respected and successful is the biggest literary understatement in the history of the world, to plagiarize the favorite phrase of our main man. ABC Television named All Over But the Shouting Memoir of the Year. Ava's Man was selected by the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance as Book of the Year, and Prince of Frogtown is being so honored for this current year. Just this past May, he was chosen as the recipient of the Harper Lee Lifetime Literary Award and got to meet that lady. The national debut book signing for the book he was born to write, The Most They Ever Had, will be in his beloved Calhoun County at Jacksonville State University, October the 7th. Mark that on your calendar. His Birmingham debut will be October 22nd. For those of you who live on Mars, this is his long-awaited book, a collection of essays about his people, mill workers. I Am a Soldier Too, the Jessica Lynch story, and Somebody Told Me round out the bibliography for this guy who promised he would not tell any secrets nor refute any words of wisdom ever uttered by our guest of honor. Unless, of course, he felt he just had to. Making room in his incredibly busy schedule to join us tonight, Rick Bragg. Lord. what happens next. Well, let's see. Making Waves, Sunny White, Same Sweet Girls, Queen of Broken Hearts, All Over the Shouting, Rival Falls, Abel's Man, Somebody Told Me, Just Lynch Story, Prince of Frogtown, The Best They Ever Had, and South of Broad. All together, these three authors have published a dozen books. But who's keeping score? To move to a more serious side, and really just for a moment, y'all know that a few health issues have caused America's favorite storyteller to curtail his normal hand-shaking, picture-taking, book-personalizing, stay all night, mingle with the crowd style that his fans have known to love. However, you may rest assured, as long as he has a heartbeat, he will sign books. Look around this room and think how strong you would have to be to sign a copy for everybody in here. And then for every member of our Signed First Editions Club, and then for the hundreds of people who weren't lucky enough to get tickets to be here tonight. And a very, very important part of Pat Conroy's signature is that the 2,000th copy looks just like the first one. His respect for his readers is obvious. As you'll see in a minute, he's getting stronger every day, and probably is going to whip up on me for even mentioning this. We sure hope he'll come back to Alabama soon, accommodate those few thousand that couldn't make it tonight, and spend all day and night so we can mingle. And until that return, I believe you will all be most thankful to wait oh, there you go. That you're the owner of what might be the hottest literary ticket in the history of the world. If you really do love this guy, and surely we do, now would be the time to show it. Pat Conroy.
I was going to say, I was about to forget, I was so carried away by all this, it was so wonderful that I was supposed to get up after you sat down and would have sat there for a while. But this is a wonderful, wonderful occasion. It is a celebration of the publication of South of Broad. Pat's new book and the first novel in 14 years, which I'm sure he's heard so much that now he's kind of tired of hearing that. Rub it in. But it is quite an event and quite a celebration. It's particularly exciting to be here. Sweet home, Alabama. I always enjoy being introduced by Jake. Okay. Jake's such a master of understatement. He's so discreet and subdued and so forth. But if the sound system will behave, I would like to take this time to talk to you just a little bit about Pat and what it's been like to have the privilege of sharing the last 12 years of my life with him. When I hear talk about the South abroad, and it's been 14 years since it came out and so forth, I have to remember what I was doing 14 years ago. It was right before that summer that I had the great honor and privilege of meeting Pat Conroy. It was right here in Birmingham, and it was at he came to the Hoover Library to get one of his many awards, and my dear friends Loretta Cobb and I went to the reception for Pat, and we arrived to find Bill Cobb and Jake talking with this broad-shouldered, blue-eyed Irishman, you know, and I had already inquired when we first got there and was told that Pat Conroy had already left, that he had taken his father, the great Santini, back to the hotel room, and I was so disappointed because I was such an admirer of his fiction. I always wanted to meet him. So I said, well, I hate that we missed him. I really would have liked to have met him. And so as luck would have it, I went over to the refreshment table and started stuffing myself because it was late. By the time we got there, it was the reception was almost over. It was late. I was starving to death, and I had my mouth full. I think I just wrote about this recently. If any of you, unlike me, but if any of you are old enough to get AARP magazine, they lowered their standards and asked me to write about this. Get closer to it. Oh my goodness. Okay. And so I was stuffing my mouth and had an absolute mouthful and was introduced to this man saying, "Oh, Cassandra, have you met Pat Conroy?" And I said, "Oh my God." So that was my first introduction. I'm surprised that it went beyond that. I'm sure he wasn't very impressed with my couthness after that. But we became friends as Jake was telling you. He went on and offered to give me a blurb. I have to say that word, offered to give me a blurb, because I have been interviewed and people have told me so many times, "I hear you met Pat Conroy when you asked him for a blurb for your first novel." And I said, no, I would never have had the nerve to ask him for a blurb for it. And a lot of other Southern writers now tell me that makes me the only writer in the U.S. that has not done so. Which doesn't altogether surprise me. But Pat and I became friends after that night, and then went on to develop more more than friendship. And this is embarrassing. And we're married 3 years later. It is surprising that Pat ever agreed to or decided that he wanted to marry me. We had to go through many trials and tribulations before that ever happened. One of the main things that happened is that I made the mistake of taking him to the farm in Pinkford, Alabama to meet my family reunion. And talk about brave. tell this to folks of Alabama. It wasn't my Alabama relatives, it was my mother's kinfolks, and they are the Florida clan. Now, I used to think that Alabama had a monopoly on rednecks, but Florida can hold her own with us in that quick. Or that could just be my family. And I knew that we had made a mistake when we pulled up into the yard, and of course there were nothing but pickups and hound dogs and bird dogs in the yard. And the pickups were covered with bumper stickers saying things like, "This truck is insured by Smith & Wesson. Crime doesn't pay, and neither does farming. And go Seminoles." But the really bigger mistake came when, by the time we got out of the car, before I could even get into the house, here comes Aunt Betty June. Now, I have a feeling that everyone in the South has an Aunt Betty June. She is a holy roller and Bible thumper of heroic proportions, both literally and figuratively. So she got right in my face, waved her finger, and said, "I know what you are doing, young lady, and your sainted mother would roll over in her grave if she were here." Instead of trying to figure that one out, I grabbed a hold of poor Pat's arm, went ahead and, to the belly of the beast and said, "Aunt Betty June, let me introduce you to my fiance." And she said, "Oh, I know who he is." And most people say, "Oh my God, Pat Conroy," and so forth. But when she said that, of course, she glared at him and my heart sank because I knew what it was. It wasn't just that I was a divorced woman who was now living in sin on Fripp Island Path. It was instead that I was going to marry an infidel, a Roman Catholic. Roman Catholics were just plain weird, with all their beads and their chants and their long robes. And she spent the rest of the day staring at me and Pat, muttering to herself about some people not even caring about hellfire and damnation. Well, somehow, after that, Pat decided to marry me anyway. Now, I don't know if the family reunion had much to do with this. I suspect that it did, but we decided to elope. And even more so, we decided not to tell anyone that we were going to get married until afterwards. We were going to wait a while. We were going to go ahead through with it. We made the arrangements with our good friend Alex Sanders, who is a judge, could perform a marriage ceremony in South Carolina. We pulled it off with only Alec and his wife Zoe as witness. So we were married in Charleston, the setting of South of Bragg. And after our marriage, we returned to our home on Fripp Island to spend our honeymoon. That time when you were going later on a trip to Italy, so that was going to be our first honeymoon. So we got caught, though, in a trap of our own making. We were married at the end of May, shortly after my youngest son, Jake, graduated from Queens College in Charlotte. On the spur of the moment, Jake decided he would treat himself to a few days at the beach for his graduation present. When he couldn't reach me, because unknown to him, I was at my wedding, in Charleston, Jake drove on down to Fripp Island from Charlotte. There, he spent the next few days with us, blissfully unaware that he was intruding on our honeymoon. So it has been quite an interesting 12 years. I have received a lot of questions about Pat. Of course, one of the main things people always ask me is, how did you meet Pat, and so forth. My favorite is, does Pat Conroy write your books? I can only say I wish, but I think that it's pretty evident. 14 years, he hadn't written one of his own. How come he's going to be but one thing, and one great thing, one of the many, many great things of having the privilege to meet and marry Pat is that I get to meet and hang around with other writers, some big shots, and so one of these being Rick Bragg. Rick I immediately identified with because we are kindred spirits and we know each other's people. We decided when we were backstage, probably most of you are kin to us. When after we met Rick and Pat had sent his mother flowers and so forth, we went to visit his mother. That is still one of the my most cherished memories. And because I knew my mother would be proud of me as a good Southern lady, I carried her a chocolate cake. So it. So that's supposed to be my segue into having Rick come forward and talk about his relationship with Pat and how thrilled we both are to be here and to celebrate this great moment, the publication of South Broad.
Were there no women in South Carolina? Have you had to go to Gadsden? God, there's so much opportunity here, I don't know where to start. I really am honored, and for you too. Also to be here with you. But there are some contradictions in Pat that I think that you should know about before you plop down any more of your good money. There is real beauty in what he does. I learned most of what I know about writing from listening to my people talk, but applying it, I learned violence from reading some Cormac McCarthy. I read color and detail from Larry B. Mercer. I learned grit by reading Eudora Welty. But I learned humanity in writing from reading Pat Conroy. young girl trading her future for a red dress. In one of my favorite books. And you'll see what I mean. There is so much to learn as a writer from this guy. But as a human being, let me share some things with you. Exactly once every 2 months, my phone will ring. Now, not any phone that I have answered for several years, but phone numbers that, like in my mom's basement where I lived 7 years ago, which he continues to call because it's too much trouble to learn my phone number. And this is the message. Bragg, Conroy. It is up to me to keep this dying friendship alive. I see this now. I could have been a father figure. And I will keep trying. When I do come up on the rare instance at a book signing that he's at, and it's usually the nicest people on the planet, they say, Mr. Conroy. And they're usually 102. And they say, Mr. Conroy, we so appreciate your kindnesses to that young riffraff. At which point, and I'm not making this up, he says, yes, ma'am. He has been a great disappointment. Did you know, for instance, that he moved to Alabama 6 months before the publication of All Over the Shout? That he is a graduate of Harvard University. And that his mother was in a sorority at that But that's not the bad part. The bad part was I was at a signing, I think it was in Monroe. And a woman walked up to me with fire and disgust in her eyes and said, is it true? And I said, is what true? And she said, is it true that you are now writing pornography? Mr. Conroy told me so. I said, Mr. Conroy, you're joking. Please tell me that's not true. At which point he bowed his head and said, yes, ma'am, it has been a devastation to me. And it just rolls on and on. This is the cliche with friends like this. You don't need enemies. But that's all right. I realize that a certain amount of rabbit killing and dog kicking you just have to face. And I am him. But I do appreciate everything that you've ever written for these people and the paragraph or two that you've written for me. don't lie you. Except for our cousins. But one of the truest things I've ever heard came from Pat, and this is actually in a newspaper, so it has to be true. When the great writer Willie Morris died, I didn't know who to call. Willie had also been kind to me, and as a matter of fact, Willie and Pat. So I called Pat and said, I don't know if you have heard, but Willie Morris has passed away. And the first thing that he asked me, which I thought was peculiar, was, where do they have him? Remember that? Where do they have him? And I didn't know what he meant. Well, he didn't know. Mississippi knows how to treat a writer. And he was quiet for another few seconds. The state of Carolina will throw my body in a Dixie dumpster. Drag you behind the Buick.
I was hoping it was not going to be part of my family. But I was working on beach music in New York, and my editor said, "You've been awarded the Hoover Library Lifetime Achievement." And I have never heard of one award I have ever received. So I get on the plane furious, and I think I'm going to California and Stanford University to the Hoover Library. I was shocked to find myself in Birmingham, Alabama. I get out in Birmingham, never in the airport in my life, and I met by Linda Andrews, and a pretty woman that worked with her at the Hoover Library in Alabama. And Linda came up, and she was my introduction to Alabama in many ways. And Linda comes up to me, "Are you Mr. Conroy?" "Yes, I am." And she looks forward and she says, "Do you sign your books?" I said, "Of course I sign my books." And she and the woman with her hugged each other and they kissed each other. And I said, "I don't quite understand this." And they said, "Shelby Foote won the award last year and refused to sign for a single person in the 500 people who came to see him receive the award." And I said, "Don't worry about that. I signed my books with pleasure. Enjoy it." Then Linda Andrews really surprises me, and here I enter into Alabama mythology. Linda looks at me and says, "Mr. Conroy, could you tell us how to get out of the Birmingham airport?" responsibility belongs to the people who picked you up. She says, you're right, we can do that. And she stops me again and she says, do you have any idea where we park? And I said, I heard this state was like this. We finally got to the car, and we get out of the parking lot only because I paid for the ticket. I did not realize that weekend I was going to be part of the Linda Andrews dating service. And it was that weekend I met Bill Loretta Cobb, the writers, all that, met Sandra, who called herself Cassandra King Ray at that particular time. When she changed her name to Cassandra King, I'd been married to her for 3 years and had no idea her name was Cassandra. But it is a state of mystery, a state that I've come to love. I have, now I'm going to throw glasses somewhere. Sandra, I leave those at the... Wait about the couch. I can't see you all, but I can see the page. And by the way, I have to say one thing about Sandra's introduction to her family in Pinkerton, Alabama at the peanut farm. What she described to you bothered her, did not bother me a bit. What bothered me is going out to the peanut farm. Sandra had not said one word about her family. I had no idea she had 3 sons. Until the Sunday Wife came out, I had no idea she'd been previously married. But as we drive up to the farm in Pinkerton, I see, this has never happened to me before or since, 50 huge farm dogs come out to greet us. And I said, Sandra, what is this? And she said, those are Daddy's dogs. He just loves dogs. And the dogs surrounded the car, then jumped up. And they're big dogs. They're looking in the window, they look at me, they don't know me. They go crazy, they bark. Then they run us back to the farm. And we get out. As I go get the baggage, dog noses were in my genitalia, in my arm. And then her 3 sorry sons greet me for the first time. And one of them even showed me the 2 tattoos of Satan that he wears on his left arm. And I said, you did well in The Preacher's Wife. I don't know what to tell you. This doesn't happen very often. Let me tell you about my mother. Rick Bragg's mother, I fell in love with. When I read the book, I just went completely crazy. I realized one of the reasons he was telling me the story of my own mother's life that she was ashamed of and I did not know. And so I read that story, and they lived in about the same place. They came from the same place. She was from around Jacksonville, Alabama. My relatives are all from Piedmont, Alabama. And I can say my mother, I had Gary Ford of Southern Living. Gary Ford of Southern Living. Did something for me when he interviewed me that was very valuable. He traced my grandfather's ancestry. And my mother was always, oh Lord, wow, it was always felt inferior, always felt she didn't belong. My mother was so innocent. she converted to Roman Catholicism because she thought it was a social step up. And Gary sends me this genealogy. And I learned the first William Peake came to this country in 1700. I had no cotton-picking idea that any of us had been here that long. And I remember I wanted to tell my mother, tell her it was okay. We've been here a long time. We had somebody, a great-great-grandfather, fight the Revolutionary War, the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, every war, we had a peak fight in that war. Then my mother fell in love with my father, Colonel Donald Conroy, USMC retired. My father, size of Rick Bragg, with a personality that looked like it had been shaped by bubonic plague. My mother falls in love with this guy on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dad would like to tell the story, the magic story of your parents meeting. So we all love these stories. And so Dad would say, it's a beautiful story. Chicago, Illinois, Irish. A IQ, the temperature of this room. Well, I introduced Dad that way one time, and he said, my God, it's hot in here. It must be at least 180 degrees. Well, my father was down on Peachtree during World War II, in his elegant phrase, hunting for broads. And my poor little 16-year-old mother comes out of Davidson's department store and crosses the street, and she's wearing a red dress, and Dad, in his eloquent, romantic way, said, hey, your mother was quite a package there, you know what I mean? And so Dad ran up to her and said, hey, how you doing? I'm in the Marine Corps here, doing some training out the air station. Why don't we go for a movie, or go for a dance, or just make out somewhere? My mother had never seen this. This is, she was like all of y'all. She has not seen this. She gets on the bus, and Dad said there was no air conditioning, so all the windows were down. He runs along the bus, and he says, hey, just give me your phone number, give me your address, tell me your daddy's name, anything, just tell me. And so the bus starts driving away, and my father, a splendid athlete, goes racing after the bus, running as fast as he can. As the bus is pulling away, my mother leans out and says, Rosedale 5, 3478. My sister, hearing the story, would scream out, tell him the wrong number, Mom. Tell him the wrong number. One number, and none of this happened. The misery, the beatings, the horror, the insanity, none of it happened. If you had, and my father just said, it's a beautiful story. This mother, I've written about her a lot. And here's why. She taught me to be passionate about the English language. She read to me every night when I was a kid. And I love her voice. I still hear her voice when I write today. And I love hearing her read. The first book she ever read, the novel she ever read me, was Gone with the Wind. Here's how my mother made it magic. Every character in there, she would apply to someone we knew in our family or in Atlanta. And she'd go, she had a great southern accent. She'd go, okay, you naturally, when you read about Scarlet O'Hara, you naturally think of your mom. Her beauty and her wit, her sharpness, and her willingness to survive anything. And when you read about Brett Butler, your daddy's over in Korea right now, fighting our nation's enemy, a fighter plane. He will remind you of Red. He has that kind of dash, that kind of flair. And then she would tell me, now Melanie Wilkes, she will remind you of your tacky Aunt Helen. And that mealy-mouthed Aunt Helen will come instantly to mind. But my mother was doing me a favor. My mother was telling me, for the first time, there was a relationship between life and art. Remember, we were in New Bern, North Carolina, and my mother kept this reading up. And it was that year she read the Diary of Anne Frank. And when you're a little boy, I think I was 6 that year, you fall in love with Anne Frank. And she's in that, attic, and she's writing these wonderful notes, and I thought, oh. And what you want as a little boy is to, you fall in love with, you want to be with her in that attic, instead of that loser she was with. And my sister got caught up with this, and the diary continued. And then suddenly, the diary ended. And my mother had not told us a single word of what was going to happen. And then finally it ends, and my sister Carol says, "What's wrong? Where's Anne?" I said, "What happened to the rest of the diary?" And my mother had to tell us about Nazi Germany, about cattle carts, about 6 million Jews dying in concentration camps, being gassed, being burned. So here were these little kids, and my sister said, "They did this to Anne Frank? Didn't they read her diary?" And my mother said something that has astonished me from that day until now. My mother said, "I would like to raise a family that will hide Jews." And she repeated, "I'd like to raise a family that will hide Jews." The next day, my sister, and I still don't know how, she was 4 years old. And my sister Carol Ann takes me next door, and we knock on the door of Mrs. Oranger's house. And Ms. Oranger came to the door, and when she opened the door, my sister said, "We will hide you." And Ms. Oranger looked at us and she goes, "What?" And it was this mother who made me, and this is important, my mother raised me to be a Southern writer, with emphasis on the word Southern. And the only literary advice she ever gave me is never be ashamed of where you come from. Except, of course, from your father's side. And she wanted that badly. And what she put me in touch with is this magical world of story. And the story, still seems conceptually to carry the Southern book. I love to read Sanders and, Rick's, the story of his mother. I just went absolutely berserk when I read that book. And it's always nice, too, when you read a book and you think, I'm entering the fields of literature. This will make me a better person. When I was reading about the literary event of the century, I think the literary event for all centuries in Alabama is when Harper Lee played with Truman Capote in The Sandlot. Okay. The next book I write, and I'm writing it now, is So I don't have to listen to my wife say, it was 14 years ago. Then he limped out with another novel. But I like the story of my father's change after we read The Great Santini. Because my father, I mean, he was, and I would tell Dad this all the time. When my mother divorced my father, he came to Atlanta. We'd never had a conversation. Ever. I loathed him. And I'm ashamed of this very fact, this very moment. I refused to go to his retirement from the Marine Corps when they gave him a parade. But I hated the guy. So he knocks on my door in Atlanta. I didn't know he knew where I lived. And he says, son, you want to go out and get a beer? We'd never been out to get a beer. We sit down at Manuel's Tavern in Atlanta. And my father lays his head down on the table and begins sobbing. I've never seen my father cry. And I said, Dad, and it was pitiful. I just was gonna. And I said, Dad, do you know what you did wrong now? Do you know where it went wrong with Mom and the kids? And my father goes, yes! I said, well, how do you think it happened? What do you think happened? And he said, I was too good, son. I should have cracked down harder. So I look at him, I say, Nero couldn't have cracked down harder. I mean, Dad, what are you talking about? But it began, The Great Santini came out, the novel. And my father hated it. It began, though, his redemption among his children. It even began his redemption with my mother. And my father became very good friends with her ex-husband. And they even got together for weekend trips after my mother died. And I said, Dad, what's wrong with this guy? Is it there's something very bad has happened to this guy. Hey, son, he knows a great man when he sees it. And my father did. What my father hated everything about the book, he went crazy about the movie, The Great Santini. And he said, too bad John Wayne is dead, son. Only he can get my incredible virility across the American people. Hollywood did me one great favor. I got him to send my father a telegram. And in the telegram it says, Colonel Conroy, we have chosen the actor to play you. And we're going to fly into Atlanta to meet you, to get to know you. His name is Truman Capote. And my father was strapping on his pistol. But when the movie came out in Duvall, and my father thought he was responsible for Robert Duvall's career. He never had a part with meat on his son. He never got a chance to show what he could do before he played me. When the 19 Academy Awards were announced that year, my father flies through the door. And he says to me in my apartment in Atlanta, he's flying through the door. He's happier than I've ever seen him. And he says, son, you and I received Academy Award nominations last night. Your mother didn't get squat. So I watched this change in my family, based partially on the books I was writing. And I saw these things take place, and it never occurred to me that I could get near my father, or near to my father, by writing books he absolutely hated. And he said, and what my father would love to do, he said, hey son, the critics, they hate you. I said, well, thanks for pointing that out, Dad. I appreciate it. And you've always been so good for my career. He would memorize a bad review from the New York Times and recite it from memory. at any party he was in Atlanta. But here is what I did not know when I began this journey as a writer. It never occurred to me that beautiful Southern mothers could die. And my mother died at 59, which now seems like a teenager. It seems young. And it devastated her 7 kids. Absolutely devastated. Devastated my father. We simply were not ready for it. We were not ready for a world that did not have Peg Conroy in it. And we aren't ready for it today. We just did not know. Then the most improbable thing happened. The great Santini began to die. And we watched this take place over a 2-year period. And he comes home with cancer toward the end of his life. I went to Dad and I said, he was in bed and he was never going to get out of that bed. I said, Dad, I want to interview you. And I want to hear about your whole career as a Marine. And he began to tell me. By this time, my father's ego was up. And I learned the most extraordinary things about my father I ever knew. You know, I knew he was a bad father. I didn't know he had killed thousands of Koreans on bombing missions during the war. And he told me one story. He was the first pilots in there in Korea. And he said the job was to keep them away from the Nakton River, keep them north of the Nakton. So Dad was the first squadron that went laying napalm in the Nakton. He surprised the North Korean battalion going across the Nakton River. He killed everyone in the battalion. I said, how did you know you killed everyone, Dad? He said, I checked. I said, what do you mean you checked? You were flying. You're too high to check. I said, wasn't that high? I got real low to check. And he said the river turned red with blood. When we were going back to the carrier, when we got word that the guys in the Army and the Marine Corps had been pinned down for weeks by terrible artillery fire. And it was doing good to see the flyboys had come in. So my father and a friend of his, Bill Lundin, his wing flew over 20 miles to these guys who were freezing, guys who were cold. And as they put their Corsairs over, Dad dipped his wings, the way he did to me on schoolyards, all through the South. And he said, son, 40,000 guys came roaring out of those trenches. 40,000 screaming at the top of their voice. He said, I never forgot. I never forgot. When my father died, we did not know he had won a single medal. He had not told us. He won a zillion medals. At one time in the Marine Corps, he was the most decorated pilot in the Marine Corps. 5 Distinguished Service Crosses. His children had no idea, because we did not know the supremely violent man was a supremely modest one also. So I'm taking the stories of Dad, and writing that, and my father suddenly realizes what I'm doing. He says, son, you're going to write another book about me, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I am, Dad. He said, your career has gone downhill since the great Santini. I was always your best subject. And then he said, is there any Hollywood interest? I said, they're all begging for the part, Dad. Who wants to star in it? I said, Redford, Hoffman, Newman, everybody in Hollywood wants to play you, Dad. And he said, I'm sick of midgets playing me, son. I want you to handle this. As my father began to die, And those words still shocked me. Dad was invincible. But by the way, I'm doing this and turning both ways because of Barack Obama. I never realized I was ignoring and insulting fully half the crowd until Obama became president. I just watched. And I asked him, I said, what's he looking at? And he was back. But in my father's, in his last days, my father's last days on earth, he started, and the kids, we wanted to come down and take care of it. Because as a kid, you always want to help your parents die right. You always want your parents to teach you how to die. And we wanted to give Dad the best we could. So all the kids came down, and we split it up, 6-hour intervals, where we were with him. My sister Carol, who's a poet in New York, she comes down, and I relieve her. I think Sandra was with me. And we relieved Carol at about 9 in the morning. And as I come up to the house, my sister Kathy's house, I hear Carol screaming at my father. You gotta tell me you love me, Dad. You gotta tell me you're proud of me, Dad. Tell me you love me. Tell me you're proud of me. She's screaming. So I go in, oldest brother, in command, in charge, citadel bearing. I bid her to come out to speak with me. And I say, Carol, she's upset, she's crying. I say, Carol, it's very important for you to know something. Dad is dying, he is not deaf. You don't have to scream at Dad. Carol says, she was brokenhearted. She says, Dad, he has never told me he loved me in my entire life. He's never told me he's proud of me in my entire life. And I said, that's not Bill Cosby dying in there. That's the great Santini. And she says, have you ever told you that? I said, oh, every day. You know, Pat, I love you so much. I wish I felt the same about Carol. And she says, I said, Carol, of course he hasn't told me he loves me. Of course he hasn't told me he's proud of me. He shows it in different ways. And she said, tell me a way he showed. I said, Carol, he sent you $1,000 a month, every month for the last 25 years, and he bragged about your poetry. And that was him saying, I love you, Carol. I'm proud. We have to learn to translate what the great Santini is saying. Then I get her calmed down. We go back in, and we sit there. Now, Alabamians, I know y'all will understand this next part. I can control a lot about my brothers and sisters except one thing. Who they marry. So my sister Kathy married Bobby Joe Harvey, who proudly bills himself as the only redneck of the Conroy family. And he thinks the family would be a lot better if we had a lot more rednecks enter the family. Well, Bobby Joe comes in, and Bobby Joe is a class C, I must tell you. This boy ain't even going to take a place in the back of the bus in Alabama. This guy rides heavy. So Bobby Joe shuffles in, you know, and he goes, he looks over at my father, who's going to be dead within a day. And he says to my dad, hey, old man, how you doing? My father looks at him And I swear he said this. I love you, Mama Joe. And my sister goes off like a Roman Catholic with this thing. What I have loved about writing about the South is I was in New York last week, and I had one reporter say, when are you going to grow up and write about something beside the South? And I said, Bubba, I hope I never do. You got it? And here's what I like about being Southern. And I really like this. I noticed when Cassandra got up, then Rick Bragg got up. I saw your participation in the literary life of Alabama. When we read these books, they end up defining who we are. And I've been proud of this from the day I started writing. And I remember my mother always, don't forget the stories. Don't forget them. I will not do it. I had a grandfather who walked with a wooden cross on Good Friday in Anniston, Alabama, to celebrate the death of Jesus. Somebody in New York told me, you made that up. I said, let me tell you something about the South. You can't make anything. It is simply impossible. But what I loved about this, y'all's response. And I wrote about Charleston because it's the most beautiful place I've ever been. And I could never be part of the South of Broad, but I know the South of Broad exists all over the South. Heard a phrase last night, never heard. I live over the mountain. And every part of the South has this. Every part has a way of differentiating itself, separates itself. Every part has it. And it is up to the writer to note that. But what I love the best in my coming to Alabama, winning the Hoover Prize, is I love being a part of a tradition. I met that night Bill and Rhoda Cobb. I read their book that comes in. Cassandra will tell me the stories of her life and time. So I read these books as she writes them. When I read Rick Bragg, All Over But the Shouting, I thought, okay, this is what literature is supposed to feel like. This is what literature sounds like. This is what literature my mother would adore. This is what she gave me at birth. And when my mother was dying, we tried to figure out a way to say goodbye to Mom. So her 7 children, we sat around her in the hospital room. And we sat there, we brought a book of poetry. And we read poetry to my mother. Because we wanted her to go out. We wanted to send her off with a great wave of the English language that I think has been made most beautiful in the South. We have suffered more. We have been misunderstood more. We deserve to be misunderstood more. But I still love when that comes together and those things happen. And it is that same wave of language which has brought all of us together tonight. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming. And I'm taking up a collection because Rick Bragg trying to buy another polo from him. And he rides with Frank Stitt. Thank you very much.